Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. It's not raining today, so that's a nice change. So today we're going to explore how the ideas of the European Enlightenment shaped the American Revolution. And we're going to focus in on the matter of religion, of course, because that's what this class is all about. And when it comes to religion in the context of the American Revolution and the early United States of America, it's these two gentlemen that we really have to talk about, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so in preparation for today's lecture, I had you read I guess it was only about 5 or 6 pages from the secularism textbook discussing these figures, the American context. And the author did draw some comparisons to what happens in France. And yes, we haven't read that section of the book yet, but you're going to read it for the next lecture, which is when we're going to tackle the French Revolution. And the reason why we're talking about America first, because the American Revolution happened first. So I'm not sure why the author felt it was necessary to talk about the French Revolution first. So you're actually going to read some earlier pages for class next Tuesday. Also, importantly, for next Tuesday, you have your first quiz of the semester. So you'll find it on the Moodle class website, and it's called simply quiz number 1. And this quiz has 5 multiple choice questions based on today's lecture. And the slides for this lecture are available in the lecture files folder. So feel free to download the PDF and review the slides as you complete that quiz. That quiz will be due at 10:50 a.m. next Tuesday. Okay, so you need to have it completed by the start of our next class. It should be pretty easy, straightforward. It's just designed to reinforce some key points from the lecture today. And then coming up, we will, next Thursday, just to get you ready, I'm going to assign the first response paper. But we'll talk about that next week. And I know some of you have already written multiple response papers for me, so that won't be new to you, but we'll talk about that for everyone else next week. Okay? So let's go ahead and dive in to today's lecture. I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that is going to deeply inform a lot of our later lectures. Right? The ideas established by chiefly these two guys, right? They weren't acting alone, but for the sake of time, we're going to focus in on them, understandably so. They are basically the chief architects of religious freedom in the United States of America. But the ideas that we'll talk about today are at the center of a lot of the debates in the public sphere that we'll be exploring in subsequent lectures. Right? Things like prayer in public school, among so many other topics. We'll be talking about things like the First Amendment again and again. So this is really important foundational knowledge. So I want to begin with some terms for you to pay special attention to. And as I think I said last time, I'm going to do this at the start of every lecture. I'm going to highlight some key terms of some key figures. Last time I highlighted John Locke and Voltaire. And here we're focusing on Jefferson and Madison, as well as the Church of England, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. And I was thinking about this a lot yesterday because I saw some things on social media where a congressperson was arguing that the 3 Muslims who are in the House of Representatives now shouldn't be allowed to take their ceremonial oath of office on the Quran. And of course, that argument directly contradicts what's in our Constitution. We'll talk about that today. And of course, the First Amendment. So let's begin by talking about that first term there, and that is the Church of England. You probably learned about the Church of England in World Religions if you took that course. The Church of England is the state religion of Great Britain, of the British Empire, established in the 16th century during what's called the English Reformation. So the English Reformation is related to the Protestant Reformation, but it took its own trajectory. And initially, The Church of England was just a dissident branch of Catholicism that didn't accept the authority of the Pope, but in time it would accept the teachings of Protestantism and become a broad-based Protestant church, right? It doesn't explicitly identify with either the teachings of Luther or Calvin, but it's all sort of admissible. So it's important for us to understand this idea of a state religion. I've probably used this term several times already this semester, but just to clarify, a state religion doesn't mean the religion of the majority of the people, right? It means more than that. This is the religion which is united with the government, with the state. And so the powers of the state are used to support and perpetuate this one particular religion. That means that government funds, taxes that are collected, are used to, for example, build churches or houses of worship for that particular religion, to fund clergy, if there is such a thing, depending on the religion. Perhaps to fund, if there were such a thing, there's not in this case because it's Protestant, something like a monastery, right? That funds can be used for religious institutions, that religion, this one particular religion is taught, for example, in public schools, that when it comes to public governmental ceremonies, that swearing in, right, where I was just talking about the idea of oaths of office, are all conducted by this one specific religious tradition. And so in the case of the British Empire, that state religion was the Church of England, or also called the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church, as I said, is Protestant. It also has an episcopal polity, which means that there's no pope, but they do have bishops. So that's different than some other forms of Protestantism where, you might have Protestants who are congregationalists, that is, each individual congregation sort of governs itself as a community. You have Presbyterians who have this notion of an elder of the community rather than bishops. But the Anglican Church is an example of what people would describe as a high church, in the sense that they have the ceremony, the ritualism, the traditional elements that have a connection to Catholicism, whereas some Protestants, the low church, really try to eliminate as much of that Catholic heritage as possible. Okay, that's not the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is an example of the high church with these traditions and, this ritualism and ceremony investments and so forth. So when the Anglican Church broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, they needed a new head of the church. And the new head of the church was the British monarch. So initially, Henry VIII, he becomes the head of the church, the defender of the faith, not the Pope. Now, that's of special significance for the American Revolution. Why? Well, because if you're revolting against the king, you can't very well continue to practice the religion that acknowledges that king as the head of the church. So breaking away from British rule also meant breaking away from the state religion, the Church of England. Now, the institutions established by the Church of England wouldn't continue in the United States, but it would become the Episcopal Church. So Episcopalians are American Anglicans, right? They revised it, removed the British monarch, because there used to be like prayers, right? God save the Queen and those sorts of things, right? Prayers for the well-being of the monarch. And if you're fighting that monarch, if you're fighting King George to achieve independence, you can't really continue to practice that type of state religion either, okay? So there had to be some changes. Now, looking at Britain, there was a time when the Anglican Church sought to impose religious uniformity. That is the idea that, okay, our state religion is the Church of England, and therefore everyone should be Anglican. So that means you don't have a choice as to what religion you want to follow. Now, you might choose to be Catholic. You might choose to be a non-believer. But then you could face arrest, persecution, coercion. And so in my last lecture, we talked about John Locke, this great English philosopher. And he advocated the idea of religious toleration. Okay? Now, his toleration was limited. Right? He didn't include, for example, non-believers. But while still acknowledging the supremacy of the Church of England, he said, look, it's no real harm to anyone to allow people to practice Catholicism, or to allow the Quakers to practice, or another branch, the Baptists, right? That is acceptable. Conditions, that once the Act of Toleration is passed, these nonconformists, right, these are Protestants who aren't Anglicans, they practice some allowed to worship, right? So this is religious toleration, but there are limits still. You can't go out and start trying to convert all the Anglicans to your sect. You can't challenge their supremacy, their doctrine, right? So it's like, all right, stay quiet, do your thing in private, and we're okay. But don't ever try and challenge the status quo. Now, religious toleration is limited. So there were some people who were excluded, right? So non-believers, this idea of atheists, what we would call humanists and so forth today. But Jews also weren't protected under the Act of Toleration. Catholics were not protected, right? The Edict of Toleration was about different forms of Protestantism. And that might sound peculiar to us today because most people couldn't even tell you the difference between the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Methodists, right, and so forth. But those differences used to be way more important. And so Britain tolerated these Protestants, but Catholics no. Unitarians no. What are Unitarians? Well, Unitarians are essentially Protestants, but in their reconstruction of Christianity based on the Bible, they went one step further than the other Protestants, and what did they do? They got rid of the Trinity. It's an anti-Trinitarian branch of Protestantism. And I can see some confusion on some of your faces. If you look in the Gospels, or in the New Testament as a whole, you don't have any explicit articulation of the Trinity. Yes, there's a reference where it says, pray in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but that still leaves a lot unsaid. What exactly does that mean? What is the relationship between those parties? So Unitarians were of the view that the Nicene formulation of three persons, co-eternal, co-equal, was not true Christianity. Okay. So being an anti-Trinitarian Protestant was not acceptable either. And Unitarianism is actually going to relatively prosper in the British colonies in North America. And we've had several Unitarian presidents, including John Adams. John and Abigail Adams were Unitarians, John Adams being the second president of the United States. This was also a time in which things that we kind of cringe to think of as crimes were enforced. So you could be arrested or even executed for the crime of blasphemy, or the crime of witchcraft. So there's a lot of challenges. Even as we're moving in this direction of toleration, there's still a lot of challenges facing people who want to be free to have their own religious convictions and opinions. So let's move across the Atlantic to the colonies, the British colonies. Now, already, since their inception, the British colonies, and you can see the 13 colonies here, were seen as a kind of refuge for nonconformists. Right? You've all heard the story of the Pilgrims, right? The Thanksgiving story. Who were the Pilgrims? They were Protestant nonconformists. That's why they came here, because they believed that the Anglican Church had not gone far enough in purging Catholic elements. They didn't go far enough in removing the old heretical practices and beliefs of the Catholics. So they consider themselves to be true biblical Protestants. And so they traveled to the colonies to be, kind of by themselves and do their own thing, to quietly practice out of the oversight of the Anglican Church. They were followed too by the Puritans. Same thing. Another branch of Protestantism that believed that the Anglicans hadn't gone far enough. The Quakers have a very different understanding of Protestant Christianity, right? This whole notion of the divine within. And then the Baptists, right? Baptists are a major branch of Protestantism, but they were at odds with the major Protestant thinkers like Luther and Calvin, right? They rejected the notion of infant baptism and insisted that you had to be an adult, make a voluntary decision to be baptized, and yes, your baptism had to involve full body immersion. So they too faced persecution, and they came here to the United States, and they became great advocates for religious freedom. The Methodists as well. The Methodists are basically Anglican dissidents. The founders of the Methodist Church were deeply influenced by the Pietist movement, which emphasized basically what we now think of as evangelical Christianity. This whole idea of an inner conversion experience, putting the emotion back into the faith, which in their view had become very mundane and dry and all about ritualism and vestments and tradition, right? Had lost that emphasis that you would find in a book like the Book of Acts on this personal religious experience. So the American colonies had become a refuge for these nonconformists. But even so, these were British territories. And so even though it allowed greater freedom to be out in the boondocks, as it were, the Church of England still created its institutions here as well and exerted the same privileges. So, for example, if you are a Baptist and you wanted to do something as simple as preside over a marriage, officiate a marriage, or preach, you couldn't do that without the approval of the Anglican authorities. You could be arrested for unlicensed preaching. It seems preposterous to us now, but that was the reality. Likewise, if you wanted to serve in public office, if you wanted to be part of the British administration, you had to be an Anglican. There was a religious test, right? You couldn't be a Baptist and work in the British Empire's administration. So this led to conflict. It led to grievances. And it led to this push for what we would come to know as freedom of religion in the future United States of America. So in addition to the Protestant nonconformists, I want to talk about some of the diversity that was present in the British colonies in North America as well. So we had other Protestant denominations. They weren't Anglican. We have Calvinists, like the Reformed Church and the Presbyterians. We've got the Lutherans. We have the French Huguenots. So in France, the dominant religion was not Protestantism, it's the Catholic Church. And we'll talk about that in my next lecture. So Protestants were in armed conflict with the Catholics in France, and they were allowed to seek refuge in Protestant British territories, such as the North American colonies. In fact, there's a very old Huguenot church in Charleston, South Carolina. Roman Catholics are also present, particularly in the states of Maryland, a real center of American Catholicism, Pennsylvania, and New York. There are non-Christians as well. Jews had come to the British colonies. And in fact, around the year 1800, the state with the largest Jewish population was South Carolina. Now, admittedly, it was still a very small population, but it happened to be the biggest Jewish population in all of the United States at that time. And one of the interesting things about the Jewish community at that time is that it was Sephardic. So Sephardic Jews are those principally associated with, historically with Spain, but after the Reconquista with North Africa, with the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire. Whereas today, the overwhelming majority of American Jews are Ashkenazi, meaning of European, particularly Central and Eastern European origin. But way back in the day, at the end of the 18th century, we had this Sephardic Jewish community in South Carolina, which happened to be the largest. We also, of course, had enslaved Africans who had been brought to the colonies to serve as a labor force for the cultivation of resources and crops. And they brought their own religious traditions, indigenous religions. And for those who came from the northernmost regions of the western coast of Africa, Sunni Muslims, Sufi Muslims as well. And I've written and published about the presence of West African Muslims in colonial South Carolina. So amidst this diversity, and the reason why I'm outlining it is because diversity of religion poses a challenge. How do you make it all work? If you have a state religion that seeks uniformity, what are you going to do? Just persecute everyone? Be in perpetual conflict? Do you really want to devote the resources to forcing religion on people? Probably not, especially if it's a far-off colony away from the central governing authority. Okay, so what about religious toleration? Well, then you have the challenge of, well, which ones do we tolerate and which ones do we not tolerate? Right? Is it just the Protestants? Do we exclude Jews and Muslims? What about non-believers? So you have these these questions: uniformity, toleration, or maybe something more radical. Total freedom of religion, total freedom of religious opinion. To answer these questions, the founding fathers, as we call them, would draw from the cutting-edge intellectual thought of the day. And who were the cutting-edge intellectual thinkers of the late 18th century? Well, that's the Enlightenment thinkers, people that we talked about last time. Voltaire, advocate of religious toleration. John Locke, advocate of religious toleration. David Hume, among others. And the American architects of this country would try to find answers to these challenges. So how did they encounter those ideas? Well, of course, you have regular shipments of texts being, so you get the works of, Candide in France and in England arriving across the sea, ending up in the personal libraries of people like Jefferson and Washington and Adams and Madison. The first printing press was brought to the United States and established in what would become Harvard University in Massachusetts in 1638. And so there we begin to have books and writings, pamphlets published right here in the United States, not dependent on shipping from across the Atlantic. And we begin to see the establishment of institutions of higher learning, universities, colleges like Harvard, but also the College of William and Mary, which ironically is named after British monarchs. And it's there in Virginia at the College of William and Mary, which still has that name, that a young Thomas Jefferson studying law, and where he would be introduced by way of the faculty and its library to the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers. And they would have a profound impact on Jefferson and his proposed solution to the problem of religious difference and diversity and governance. The United States would become a center of cutting-edge intellectual thought. And it still is today. People come here from around the world to attend our universities. That's one of the great treasures of America is our institution of higher learning. There's a reason why people from all over the world, including from Europe, come to the United States to study. And it's not just, to have fun in America, right? They come here because to have a college degree from an American university carries prestige all over the world. And of course, America presented an entire laboratory of new discoveries. It's a new continent, new plants, new animals, new peoples and cultures. All kinds of cutting-edge discoveries are occurring here and helping to build this whole tradition of higher learning in America. But it's not enough just to have these texts. It's not enough just to have students going to universities. We need to extend this knowledge out into the public, the people, right? Part of the public sphere. Well, that's where certain institutions come into play. Things like Masonic lodges, places where people gather to discuss and exchange ideas. So someone, maybe reads Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and they meet with the group and they chat and they discuss those ideas and how it might work in the American context. And from there, those ideas are shared and spread. Well, Freemasonry was a key contributor to that. We talked last time about the tavern culture. Right? The taverns weren't just places to get a brew, right? They were hotels, they were post offices, they were assembly halls, they were courtrooms. So the taverns are part of that. But other facilities like Masonic lodges. Now, the first Masonic lodge was established in Philadelphia, and Benjamin Franklin himself, one of our celebrated founding fathers, although never a president, was a founding member. So it's important for us just to take a brief moment and clarify what Freemasonry is. I think most people have heard the term Freemason before, but they don't quite understand what it is. And I'll tell you that there's a great deal of misunderstanding when it comes to Freemasonry. In a world in which conspiracy theories thrive, Freemasonry has been the frequent fixation of conspiracy theorists. This idea that Masons are kind of this secretive network of powerful elites who are controlling and manipulating the world in all these theories. Well, those types of conspiracy theories actually have a long history, and they were first articulated by religious conservatives who didn't like the free thinking and liberal thought of the Masons. There was actually an entire political party here in the United States that was an anti-Mason party. And those conspiracy theories still thrive. My main focus of research, of course, is Islamic studies. And one of the surprising things I found when reading the founding charter of the militant Palestinian Islamist group Hamas is that in addition to talking about fighting the so-called Zionist enemy, they also talk about fighting Freemasons. I don't think there's a lot of Freemasons in Gaza, but it's in there. And you say, why is that in there? It's because they're reading, in addition to reading anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion and stuff, they're reading other conspiracy theories as well. So the Masons they're distorted by many people. So I want to just clarify what they are. Freemasonry is a fraternal society. What's a fraternal society? Well, think of it like the Boy Scouts. Think of it like a college fraternity, except it's for adult men. It's an organization that you join that helps to establish a social network, fraternal bonds of cooperation. And together, they work on various service projects. They promote civic and moral virtues. And they utilize ceremony and ritual to mark achievements, but also to strengthen their sense of community and social bonds. And the fact that they use rituals is part of the suspicion, right? Because people go, oh, is it an evil ritual? Right? Is it a satanic ritual? No, it's a ritual just like college graduation is a ritual. Or if you become an Eagle Scout, it's a ritual. Or if you join a college fraternity, there's a ritual, right, by which you join. They have rituals as well. Now, one of the reasons why people particularly get fixated with Masonic rituals is because it's also secret. It's not super secret. You can read about it. It's out there. But it's done behind closed doors. It's for members only. And so the Masons believe that what goes on within the lodges is between members. And they discussed and promoted certain ideas. Now, the goal of these organizations was to try and avoid division among members. So in terms of, at least within the lodges themselves, forceful positions about politics or religion that could prove divisive, those things were avoided. But nevertheless, there was a general agreement on what we could describe as ecumenical theism. What does that mean? Well, theism is a belief in a deity. Ecumenical in the sense of, let's try and bring as many people together as possible. So Masonry is not an atheist, non-believer organization. It actually requires that you believe in a higher power or a deity in order to join. Now, it doesn't matter whether you believe that's the Holy Trinity, or you believe that's Allah, or you believe that's Hashem, whatever it may be, but you have to believe in a higher power. So this spirit of ecumenical theism is something that we're going to see play out in the American experience as well. We'll see it in the founding documents of the United States, that there's this kind of ecumenical theism that permeates, for example, the Declaration of Independence. So Masonry begins in England in the 17th century, and it then extends wherever the British go. So it ends up, of course, in the British colonies. Now, if you were to ask Masons themselves, they might tell you a different story. They might tell you a story about how their orders, Masonry goes back to ancient stonemasons, and perhaps even back to the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Those are origin myths. Right? Those are stories that there's no historical basis for, but it's part of the mystique of it. And for our interests, again, this is another forum for the discussion of ideas, a contribution to the emergence of the public sphere, right? Separate from the state. The state is over here. Here we have the separate network, typically of educated, well-read human beings who may establish business ties and things like that, allowing to think about their society, their government, and then act on those concerns. And by the way, my paternal grandfather was a Mason as well. So one of the notable Masons for the United States of America was its first president, George Washington. George Washington became a Mason in Virginia at the age of 20. He joined Lodge number 4 in Fredericksburg. And here we see a depiction. Both of these are from the 19th century, so these are not contemporary depictions of Washington. But he's depicted in the ceremonial garb of a Masonic order. And many people have noted the influence of Masonic symbolism on early American symbolism, and that stuff is debated. Whether it's American Masons influencing American symbolism or American symbolism influencing American Masons. We'll return to the Great Seal of the United States at the very end of the lecture today. Here we have the College of William and Mary, where Thomas Jefferson, who was not a Mason, studied law and encountered the ideas of the European Enlightenment that would so greatly inform his later ideas. And when this college was first established in the late 17th century, it had a divinity school specifically for the training of Anglican ministers. Now, with the American Revolution, that school would close. So William and Mary is still with us today, but of course it doesn't train Anglican ministers anymore. So let's talk more about Jefferson. Jefferson from Virginia was from an Anglican family, right? So his family's from the British tradition of the Church of England. And he was a man born into a life of wealth and privilege, inherited lands. Of course, I'm sure you've all heard of Monticello and that he was a slave owner and had vast land that was worked by this enslaved labor force. And that wealth afforded him the opportunity to go to college. Couldn't apply for Pell Grant or something like that, but he had the wealth to do so. And so he went to William and Mary to train as a lawyer. And while studying these works, he became a deist. So we talked about deism last time. Figures like Voltaire were deists. And that meant that Jefferson believed that there was a creator deity who crafted the laws of the universe, the earth, humanity, and then essentially let it go on its own. Now, if you look at the writings of Jefferson, although he was a deist, he also believed in the idea of divine providence, which means that contrary to conventional deism, he still believed that the creator, God, still played a role in the unfolding of human history. And so he saw, for example, the success of the Americans in defeating the British Empire to achieve independence as an example of divine providence, as if fate, as if destiny were unfolding. That idea is contrary to conventional deism. But beyond that, he was someone who firmly rejected the idea of religious clerics. He rejected the idea of miracles, of supernaturalism. He believed that Jesus was simply a human being, not born of a virgin, but a human being who was basically a moral genius, exemplary in his moral virtue. And so he did things like he took a Bible and he took a razor and he cut out any of the miracle stories or anything like exorcisms, leaving just like Jesus as a human moral teacher. And so he would say, well, I am a Christian in the sense that I follow the moral teachings of Jesus, but I'm not a Christian in the sense of I belong to the organized religion of Christianity with its practices and its doctrines of atonement and the Trinity and so forth. So he was very much a religious free thinker. Jefferson, obviously, would not be interested in helping to establish a country in which he could be persecuted as a heretic. So if he's a free thinker, he wants to help establish a country in which he will be free to continue these unique religious opinions. And in Virginia, working with his protege, his close colleague, and later his presidential successor, James Madison, he advocated the idea that the state of Virginia should have no state religion. No state religion. Get rid of the Anglican Church or its American successor. That people should be able to have total freedom of religion. Now, he had been an ambassador to France in the late 1780s. And so as the French Revolution begins to unfold in the 1790s, he's a vocal supporter of the French Revolution. And he advocated American intervention on behalf of the revolutionaries, but that didn't materialize because of the weakness of the United States, having just fought the British, just achieved independence. Washington and others did not advocate support for that. When he later ran for president in probably the closest contested election in US history, his opponents accused him of being an atheist, a non-believer. That is not the case. He most certainly believed in God, right? In this creator deity. But because his religious ideas were indeed unconventional, that he wasn't a traditional Christian, people exaggerated that to try and discredit him. Well, he did become the third president of the United States, and it's during his tenure as president that he coined this famous phrase, which people use all the time today, and people sometimes think that it's actually in the Constitution. It's Jefferson who coins the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. And he composed that phrase in a letter to a community of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, talking about the establishment of religious freedom. And the Baptists, as I said before, were strong proponents of religious freedom. Why? Because although they were Protestants, their unique interpretations of the Bible were contrary not only to Catholicism, but also other forms of Protestantism, like the Lutherans and the Calvinists. And so they had been persecuted, for example, by the Anglican Church. Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence. And I want to draw your attention to his wording, to his phrasing here, because we can see the influence of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke on Jefferson's writing. He writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This is essentially right out of the writings of Locke. And in this formulation, this idea that the Creator endows his creation with certain inalienable rights, this is natural rights. Foundational idea of the European Enlightenment. Just by virtue of being a human being, you possess these rights. Rights are not granted to you by a government based on whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant or you're white or black or whatever it may be, male or female. You're endowed by existing as a creation of God. So, moving beyond the Declaration of Independence, let's look at a document produced by Jefferson that deals specifically with the subject of religion and the relationship between religion and state. Jefferson, a native of Virginia, as was Jefferson, as was Washington, leads the fight against the idea of a state religion. And he most certainly had opponents. There were others who said, no, we have to have a state religion. If you don't have a state religion, then people will fall into immorality and sin. So for the salvation of our people, we must have state religion. But Jefferson said the opposite. Right? He applied sort of this, bless you, this free market capitalist idea of the free open competition of ideas. The scheme being that the best ideas are going to be the ones that survive. That people will have to compete and basically offer the best product, the best teachings, the best preachers who meet the needs of the people. And that if you have state support, you have lazy preachers who are just taking money from the government. You have corruption. You have all these things. So it's actually for the health of religion that you should have religious liberty. So here's what Jefferson writes. 1786. The Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship. At the time, Anglican authorities used to actually take attendance at church. And if you didn't go to church, you'd be fined. Right? Can you imagine that? Place or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So not only do you have freedom of religion and religious opinion, but your rights as a citizen are not dependent on those opinions, right? So think back to the context of 17th century England. You have religious toleration, but based on whether you're an Anglican or a Lutheran, your civil capacities, right, your rights, for example, your ability to hold public office, to go to parliament, were different depending on your religious opinions. And Jefferson is arguing those things should be completely separate from each other. Your ability, your rights as a citizen shouldn't be impacted by what your religious opinions are. That's a separate affair. So Jefferson's work here becomes a huge influence on what will be crafted chiefly by Madison in the Bill of Rights, right, the First Amendment. Here we have Jefferson's famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he coins this phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. He writes, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," right? He's quoting the First Amendment, "thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties." So he sees this separation as integral to the protection of freedom and liberty, the protection of a human being's natural rights. So I want to share with you a video clip. And just in case we have a situation where the stream is stopped by YouTube for copyright, we know from our experience last time that the stream actually resumes once I stop it. So if in the event that YouTube does stop the stream based on this clip, just wait a minute, I'll stop the clip and the live stream will resume. Okay, let's take a look.
1776, Jeremiah Moore brought a petition to the Virginia Assembly demanding the right for Baptists to be free to worship without fear of persecution.
Equal liberty, that invaluable blessing, which, though it be the birthright of every good member of the state, is what your petitioners have been deprived of.
10,000 names were on the petition.
And they were looking for an advocate. An advocate to go into the courts and at least make their case.
They found their advocate in Thomas Jefferson. As a member of the Virginia Assembly, he'd received the Baptists' petition. Weeks before, he drafted America's Declaration of Independence. And what he would now undertake on behalf of the Baptists would enshrine religious liberty as an American value.
This one is obvious to him. This one is very obvious to him. Suddenly, in his backyard is an example of the worst kind of abuse that government can do.
We tend to think of Jefferson as a sort of anti-religious person, but he was intensely religious, or as we might say now, he was spiritual but not religious. But he thought that it was up to the individuals. And he didn't want the state to tell him what to think. We think of Jefferson as a rationalist, but in some way this is also an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation, where the Protestants are saying every individual is free to read the Bible for himself and figure out what it says. Jefferson wanted us to do that too. He wanted us to be free to look at the evidence in the world of religion and decide what we thought it all meant.
Jefferson's own religion had nothing in common with Baptist beliefs. He created his own version of the Gospels, keeping only what he believed relevant, cutting out the rest.
And he takes away all the narrative, all the miracles, all of that stuff that just won't stand rational inspection. No, Jesus didn't raise Lazarus because there is no exemption to death. But Jesus says, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. This is divine wisdom. And no institution can mediate it for you, including a church, let alone a government.
I cannot give up my guidance to the magistrate because he knows no more of the way to heaven than I do and is less concerned to direct me right than I am to go right. Jefferson met with Virginia's leading Baptists, who told him of their struggle to practice their faith.
Jefferson said, I couldn't disagree with you more about the substance of all of this, but I will defend your right to say it. And that's exactly what he does.
Jefferson joined forces with the Baptists.
And their idea, which is radical at the time, is you disestablish the church. You allow every religious sect and denomination to compete in the marketplace of ideas.
Jefferson began to draft a bill that would end state-supported religion.
No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever.
Ministers are not going to grow fat and lazy relying on a check from the state. Rather, they're going to become diligent.
Jefferson went further. Individuals must be free to worship as they choose.
All men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion.
It's through this competition of religious sects and denominations that the purest and the most efficacious faith in church will prevail in Virginia.
But when Jefferson submitted his bill to the Virginia Assembly, it was met with fierce opposition by many Virginians, including his fellow revolutionary, Patrick Henry.
It tells us something about precisely how radical and revolutionary this idea is, that even these revolutionary Virginians suddenly, when actually faced with the possibility of religious freedom, there was a sort of collective sense of needing to pause and slow things down a bit.
Henry feared that without state support, religion in Virginia would wither and die. At war's end, he drafted a bill that would fund not just the Anglican Church, but other approved denominations. When the Baptists read Henry's proposed bill, they were outraged.
This is still state control or state funding or state monitoring of religious institutions, and we want hands off.
Baptist support for Jefferson's vision of a religiously free Virginia grew more vocal. Their message struck a chord with ordinary Virginians who had fought for America's independence. In January 1786, Jefferson's bill was finally passed.
That connection was so palpable between the tyranny of a government that didn't allow you to do your own thing and the tyranny of religious groups that wouldn't allow you to do your own thing, that we decided that, yes, it was worth the risk. We need to try.
And when a year later, the Constitution was being drafted in Philadelphia, Jefferson and the Baptists hoped that their hard-fought principle of separating church from state would be part of the country's founding document. But when the Constitution was presented in September 1787, in not one of the 7 articles was there any guarantee of religious liberty or other individual rights.
People were incensed. Here was a constitution that created a very powerful central government. Surely individual rights ought to be protected, ought to be specified. That was the concern.
The Constitution's framers wanted to create a more perfect union, and some feared that statements on religion would be divisive. But Jefferson believed their fears were unfounded, that defending an individual's liberties through a Bill of Rights would hold the country together.
Jefferson says, let's do this experiment. Let's see what happens. But I think he had a real faith, we might say, in the power of freedom of conscience. And he believed that we could be held together through other sorts of things other than a shared religion. And those would be shared values around things like democracy and things like freedom.
Virginia and 4 other states agreed with Jefferson and demanded a guarantee of individual rights. On September 25th, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York, America's first Congress proposed a Bill of Rights. The First Amendment was ratified and became part of the Constitution in 1791.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Years later, as president, Thomas Jefferson would define the First Amendment as having erected a wall of separation between church and state.
The metaphor is so strong that people often think that, oh, the First Amendment means that there should be a wall of separation of church and state. It doesn't mean that at all. You know, it says that we are not going to establish laws that are going to favor one religion over another. But it doesn't say exactly what kind of barrier there's going to be.
Like the new nation, the First Amendment would be a work in progress. But with no national church, religion would not be guaranteed a place at the center of public life. No other nation had ever taken such a step.
Okay. So the nation that will follow the American experiment, of course, will be France, and that's what we'll be talking about next time. But let's talk about Madison now. So Madison is the chief author of the Bill of Rights, right? The document that finally provides that guarantee of religious liberty for this new nation. Well, who was James Madison? Well, he too was from Virginia. He was born into an Anglican family, just like Jefferson. He didn't study at the College of William and Mary. He went to New Jersey and studied what would become, I think it was originally called the College of New Jersey, what would become Princeton University, and he focused on political philosophy, and he embraced deism as well. Although, as his life would proceed, scholars debate about his religious views near the end of his life. Did he abandon deism as well? Did he move back towards a more traditional Christian framework? But at the core of his life and his intellectual activity, he, like Jefferson and Voltaire and others, was a deist. He was often regarded as the protege of Jefferson. And as I said, he was the chief author of the Bill of Rights, right? Laying down this guarantee of religious freedom, which he continued to defend as the 4th president of the United States. Let's look at these documents now. So first, let's look at the Constitution itself. So the Constitution did not enshrine religious freedom. That's why we needed the Bill of Rights. But it did include this notable passage, right? Article 6 of the Constitution. And as I said at the start of class, people often don't realize that this is in there because I periodically hear politicians saying things that, that people should be forced to be sworn in on a Bible, right, in order to serve in public office. But that's actually directly against the Constitution. Why? Because the Constitution says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, which is to say that you can't be barred from serving in a public office like being an elected official or a cabinet member or something like that based on what your religion is or lack thereof. Why is this being pointed out in this document? Because when the Anglican Church was the state religion, you had to be an Anglican to serve in public office. So the Founding Fathers get rid of this, right? Shouldn't matter whether you're Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or Mormon or a Scientologist, right? It doesn't matter. That is separate. Your capacities as a citizen and abilities to serve in government stand on their own. And you can't be denied those capabilities based on what your religious affiliation or your opinions are. But the founding fathers decided we needed more than that. We needed to enshrine religious freedom, and that comes in the form of the First Amendment. That Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, the First Amendment goes on to protect freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is important when we think about religion in public life, because in some countries, there are things called blasphemy laws. That if you say things that are religiously offensive or you criticize religion, you can end up in jail or even executed. But freedom of speech protects that. The government can't say, you're not allowed to insult the Pope. Right? And we'll lock you up if you insult the Pope. In this country, you can insult the president, you can insult Jesus, you can insult Muhammad. It doesn't matter. And you might offend people. People are free to express their opposition to those comments. But the government can't restrict you from saying it. Now, of course, there are some questions that arise. For example, can you walk into a crowded building and yell fire? No, you can't do that, right? So it's within public order and public well-being. We also have freedom of the press, and of course, newspapers were essential to the emergence of the public sphere, a way of sharing ideas and opening debate, right? Habermas talked about the emergence of mass print as integral to the emergence of the public sphere and thus democracy. So freedom of the press is hugely important. The right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. But it's these two clauses that are our central focus: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So the Establishment Clause says that the government can't demonstrate any preference for one religion over another. It's not that public officials can't, quote the Bible. It's that the government can't, for example, take taxpayer dollars to build Lutheran churches. If it did that, it would have to provide funds for every single religious group, because as soon as it shows preference for one over others, it violates the Establishment Clause. So, for example, later on we'll talk about tax-exempt status, which sounds a little bit like funding of religion. But you can't say that, all right, so churches are tax-exempt and synagogues and mosques are tax-exempt, but other religious groups, like those Scientologists, they're not tax-exempt. That's discriminating against a religious group. But then that also raises questions about what constitutes a religious group, right? That's another issue that we'll have to talk about. And so the government can enforce laws that demonstrate some preference for one religious group or even one type of religion, right? It's not just a particular sect. That favoring a particular family of religions can be viewed as a violation. So if, for example, there was some law favoring monotheistic religions that could be perceived as biased towards a polytheistic religion like Hinduism, that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. At least that's what the courts have determined. Right? All these things are subject to debate and adjudication. Free Exercise Clause. So here too, the government can't step in and prevent you from practicing your religious beliefs. But there too, just like the freedom of speech, there are limits that we have to deal with. For example, if your religious belief is that you should have the right by God to murder the infidel, or kill someone who commits blasphemy, that's where your freedom of religion stops. Right? So it's within some common sense limits. Or if your religion necessitated the ingestion of illegal narcotics, that's another interesting debate, and that's a real case. So there are Native American groups, for example, that ingest peyote. Peyote is illegal, but it's a religious practice. So it went to the courts. So for most people, ingesting peyote remains illegal, but Native American groups won the right to use this in specifically religious capacities, right? Free exercise. So these clauses, these parts of the First Amendment are going to show up again and again this semester as we look at American cases. Obviously, when we look at other countries, other contexts, we're dealing with different constitutions, different rights, different laws. But when we look at American cases, we'll be looking at how these clauses are interpreted in all these different interesting contexts and seeing the debates about them. Lastly, I wanted to just talk about the Great Seal of the United States. So when the United States succeeds in defeating the British Empire, achieving independence, the Founding Fathers adopt a symbol to represent the new nation, a symbol that will appear on all the official documents of the United States of America. And this is called the Great Seal of the United States. It was officially adopted in 1782. So this is the front of the Great Seal, and this is the reverse side. And when we look at the words and the symbols here, we can get a sense for the influences that impacted the way the Founding Fathers thought about this new nation. So we can see the number 13 showing up a lot. That represents the 13 colonies. 13 original colonies, the British colonies that would become the United States. They're represented here by 13 stars, 13 leaves on the olive branch, 13 arrows, symbolizing peace and war. We have the bald eagle, the sort of national totem of the United States of America. And we have this motto, E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of the many, one. Notice that it doesn't say in God we trust. So today, the motto of the United States of America is in God we trust. That wasn't enacted until the 1950s. That was a work of President Eisenhower during the Cold War. And later on this semester, we'll talk about the role that religion played during the Cold War and how we see an increasing, what we might describe as a Christianization of American public life during the Cold War. We have, for example, the introduction of the motto, in God we trust, the addition of under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, the addition of in God we trust to paper currency, the start of the National Prayer Breakfast. Suddenly, theism is mobilized in the public sphere in this war against godless atheistic communism, the Soviet Union, in the 1950s. And that remains with us to this day. But if you look back at the time of the birth of this country, those elements weren't necessarily there. We can still detect a kind of ecumenical theism, right? This broad-based notion of a deity, of a creator. We have on the reverse side, he favors our understandings, understood to be a reference to divine providence, to a God. We have the eye of providence here, topping the pyramid. This symbol, by the way, would also enter into usage among the Freemasons. And we have an unfinished pyramid, the idea that our nation, right, we're continually striving towards a more perfect union. Right? The United States wasn't done when it was founded, something that you had to continue to build. At the base of the pyramid is 1776, the starting point, the foundation, but we continue to build it. This perhaps also has Masonic significance. Masonry is originating with the stonemasons and the pyramid and the secrets of constructing the pyramids. And we have another phrase in Latin here, new order of the age. The American experiment was something completely new. And American freedom of religion was something completely new. And it's something that doesn't exist for most people around the world today. Right? While some countries would follow the lead of the United States of America, others would not only not go in that direction, but in some cases, people moved towards secularism and then went the other direction. Sometimes we tend to think of, the passage of time as inherently progressive, right? That, oh yes, these things are all better and we're going to continue to move this way. But, stuff goes the other way too. And we'll look at Iran. And in Iran, we had a secular constitutional monarchy. But in 1979, that monarchy was overthrown. And what did they replace it with? An Islamic republic that had a firm state religion, total state control, where in fact, in place of the monarch was a 12-er Shia religious cleric, a grand Ayatollah, total merger of state and religion. Not as a direct continuity of the past, but as a rejection of what had previously been a secular order. So we shouldn't assume that, once people understand, they're going to shed those things and move towards, Enlightenment ideas. Goes the other way as well. And we'll see that in the case of Iran and some other circumstances as well. We're seeing that in India right now. India, when it was established in 1947, embraced freedom of religion and secularism, and it's moving in the opposite direction in a really alarming way, where Hindu nationalism is threatening the second largest Muslim community in the entire world in really alarming and violent ways. So we'll be looking at that later this semester as well. But our subject for next time is the French Revolution. So this occurred in the United States, and it was immediately followed by Jefferson's friends and Benjamin Franklin's friends over in Paris, building off of the ideas of people like Voltaire to overthrow a monarchy and experiment with a completely different socio-political order. So we'll talk about the French Revolution. In preparation for that, read pages 18 through 23 in Copson, and don't forget to do the online quiz. So the online quiz is 5 multiple choice questions based on today's lecture about Jefferson and Madison, and we'll run through the answers for that quiz at the start of class next time. Okay, that is all for today. I'm glad the live stream didn't cut out during the video clip, and have a good weekend.